Yes. Okay. So these are our sponsors for this particular program. Loring Greenough House, us, Hidden Jamaica Plain, lots of us, and we are convened by Mimi and the Jamaica Plain Historical Society, which is an awesome group, and they're they're making this possible for you to sit here and see this, and folks on Zoom to see it. So we're very happy to do this. Okay. I'm going to present Mimi now, and she's going to talk to you about what she's got.
With the non-cookie clicker.
Yeah.
So how did this get started? Can Gretchen, can you see me in the
Or over the camera.
I can't
Over
that dot. Okay. Hi there. I'm Mimi Peachy. I'm the convener of Hidden Jamaica Plain. And you might wonder, how did this get started? What happened was about 2.5 years ago, I went on a tour with the Hidden Brookline with Barbara Brown and a bunch of other people, and through the Brookline Adult Ed program. And she showed us a bunch of different things. We walked around and toured. But one thing that she showed us that just was an aha moment for me was this map. This map represents Brookline in 1746. And the blue parts are property that was owned by people who enslaved others. That land was worked by enslaved people. So as you can see, almost 50% of Brookline was had the farms had enslaved people on them. What I then started thinking when I came back to Jamaica Plain was, if it's happening in Brookline, it must be happening in JP. So I started poking around, starting actually with the JP Historical Society's website. And I found mentions, and then I started poking around a little bit more, and I found more mentions. So the next thing I did was I went to, okay, that. There. Oh, page down. I'll just do page down. Let's do it. Okay. So I went to the Historical Society and said, I think this might be the beginning of something, and maybe we could do a tour. And so they assigned a couple people to work on it, and they looked at me and they said, this isn't enough. This is going to take a lot of research. We need more people. So then we went over to Loring Greenough House, First Church in Jamaica Plain, Elliott School, the First Baptist, and we started to attract more people. Elliott School, we started to talk to other people, and it turned out all these institutions were doing their own research. So we decided that we would meet once a month and just exchange information and see how far we could get collectively. So instead of rowing each our little boats, we all of a sudden had a nice flotilla. And we were able to attract some community activists, people from the academic community, and we engaged with two wonderful advisors, Crystal Rollins Jackson and Byron Rushing. This is 100% volunteer effort, and if you're excited by the things that you're going to hear about tonight, I would invite you to join us. The goals started off very modestly, but they sort of expanded as more people joined the group. So beyond just identifying enslaved people and enslavers from the 16 and 1700s in Jamaica Plain and developing a picture of their lives and the economic system and the societal institutions that supported slavery, we expanded in both directions. We realized that we really couldn't understand the history of slavery in New England unless we understood the history of this land, the history of the indigenous people who lived on this land in reciprocity with it, and how Europeans came and claimed that land and took it from them. And it's important to say that enslavement in New England started with the enslavement of indigenous people in the 1600s. And that enslavement continued through the 1700s as well. We then looked to, which we haven't gotten there yet. We've been mostly focused on the 16 and 1700s, but our goal is to move forward towards developing a history of abolitionism in Jamaica Plain and researching 19th, 20th, and 21st century movements that made an impact in JP that were led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color. So to go back, the important things to know is that Massachusetts started in 1638 enslaving people. And over the next 150 years, 175 transatlantic enslaving voyages originated in Boston. Over 1,000 newspaper ads were published for the sale of Africans that were brought back to Boston for sale. Not Boston, but Massachusetts became the first colony to legally sanction slavery in 1641. And you'll see on the slide the piece of the 1641 Massachusetts Body of Liberties. And then the colony went on to enact numerous laws that regulated movement and marriage and many other activities of enslaved people. And it's also important to note that people in Massachusetts actively participated in and profited from the slave trade, and as well as slave economies. A lot of the farmers in Massachusetts, including Jamaica Plain, were growing crops that were sold as foodstuffs to the Caribbean, where enslaved people were forced to work in the one-crop sugar economies of the Caribbean. And so they didn't even want that sugar was so valuable, they didn't even want to grow their own food on that land. So they imported it from Massachusetts. I'm going to read this whole thing because this is an interesting quote which we found recently. Because some people wonder, how widespread was this? And this is a report of an eyewitness in 1687 who was a French Protestant refugee who came to Boston, and he reported, "You can bring with you hired help in any vocation whatever. There's an absolute need of them to till the land. You may also own Negroes and Negresses. There is not a house in Boston, however small it may be its means, that has not one or two. There are those that have 5 or 6, and all make a good living." And I'm assuming that reference is not to those people who were doing the work, but those who were benefiting from that work. "You employ savages in your fields in consideration of 1 shilling and a half a day in board, which is 18 pence. It being always understood that you must provide them with beasts and utensils for labor. It is better to have hired men to till your land. Negroes cost from 20 to 40 pistoles, which was a gold coin, accordingly as they are skillful or robust. There's no danger that they'll leave you, nor hired help likewise. For the moment one is missing from town, you have only to notify the savages, who, provided you promise them something and describe the man to them, he is right soon found. But it happens rarely that they quit you, for they would not know where to go, there being few trodden roads, and those which are trodden lead to English towns or villages, which on your writing will immediately send back your men." So this paints, I think, an extremely vivid graphic picture of what it was like for enslaved people and indigenous people in that period. In Boston, about 35 years later, Boston archaeology did some research, and they found that about 12% of Boston's population were enslaved in the 1720s. And there's a wonderful exhibit at Faneuil Hall. So if you haven't gotten there, I would encourage you to go there. It's on the first floor and the basement. They estimate that 25% of Boston households, about 1 out of 4 enslaved people. And as was previously said, like in 1787, that eyewitness, most enslaver households had 1 to 2 people. In the city, they were involved primarily in household service, unskilled work, and skilled craft. And this picture shows, it's hard to see it, but there is a black person pushing the cart in that painting, which was done in 1801. So who were the enslavers in Jamaica Plain? We know today of Jamaica Plain as a neighborhood of Boston, but formerly it was part of Roxbury, which was a separate town. So we looked in the Roxbury records, and the 1771 tax records showed that nearly 11% of the people listed, the household owners, were also owners of, quote, servants for life, unquote. And that was a euphemism for enslaved people. Enslaved people worked in the Boston townhouses, but in Roxbury, they also worked on farms and in country estates. We have beautiful Jamaica Pond, and it was ringed by estates of wealthy people. And there we have evidence that there were multiple enslaved people who worked in those houses around Jamaica Pond. Up until the Revolution, some of the enslavers were people like Joshua Loring, who built this house. Afterwards, there were, well, actually, up to the war as well, and afterwards, there were Revolutionary War patriots, including David Loring Greenough, who then became the owner of this house later, and Fonside resident John Hancock, who were also enslavers. And across the street, the founders of First Church in Jamaica Plain, which at that point was Third Parish in Roxbury, included Eleazar Weld and John Morey, both of whom were enslavers. In addition, leaders of Harvard University and other institutions who lived in Jamaica Plain or had country estates here were enslavers. It's important to know that this was pervasive throughout the entire society. It was not just rich people. It included people who were enslavers, included farmers, craftsmen, ministers. Ministers were one of the most common sets of enslavers because they were busy teaching school and preaching and so on. So they needed people, according to them, at the time, it was thought that they needed people to help them and work in their fields and do their housework. Widows, lawyers, selectmen, we have evidence of all these people enslaving others. The industries that were most commonly used for enslaving were seafaring. They were the dirtiest and hardest work. Seafaring, shipbuilding, distilling, and in Jamaica Plain, along the Stony Brook, the tanning of hides. And these are just a few of the areas in which enslaved people were used. And so there were many from other sectors of society as well. So how did slavery end in Massachusetts? We need to be clear. It came directly from the efforts of enslaved people themselves. Enslaved people filed numerous petitions, they filed lawsuits, and finally, in 1783, a series of court cases, the most famous of which are known as the Quack Walker and Elizabeth Freeman, also known as Mumbet cases, established the legal basis for emancipation. Now, this was not like an emancipation proclamation, where all of a sudden somebody said, oh, you're free, and that was the end of it. But what it meant was that enslaved individuals could leave or sue their enslavers, and the law would be on their side. And many people did. They just left and moved on. After 1783, there was, even 100 years after that 1687 letter that I read, there was still a lack of workers. So the enslavers escalated indenturing, which was a different system, of taking poor and orphaned white, African white and indigenous children and forcing them to provide unpaid labor. It was the typical age was 18 for girls and 21 for boys. And after that, they were free. In Jamaica Plain, we know that at least 27 people were enslaved in our neighborhood in the 1700s. We have information about them. We have found their names. We also know, based on that, that that's just the tip of the iceberg. We believe much more research is needed. If you're interested in this, we have Hidden Jamaica Plain has developed several articles that are on the Jamaica Plain Historical Society's website, and we encourage you to take a look at those. We also discovered that so far, again, we're sure that there are more, but at this point we know the names of at least 6 people who were indentured in the 1700s in Jamaica Plain. James Perkins was a slave trader who later turned to opium smuggling into China, lived in Jamaica Plain in the early 1800s. You may have seen his pondside, the remains of his pondside residence, which are above there's a stairwell that goes up from the pond, and at the top is the third Perkins house. We know that in this house, successive families enslaved and indentured people. And as I mentioned earlier, some of the founders of First Church across the street were enslavers. We also have discovered that the death records at First Church contain some interesting records from the early 1800s that include free Black Americans. And our colleagues at First Church have done a lot of research in trying to find out more about those people. So on this land, what happened? Before the Lorings and the Greenoughs, the place we call Jamaica Plain was part of the homelands of the Massachusetts people. In 2022, Loring Greenough House was doing some renovation, and they invited Boston Archaeology to come here, and they did a dig and discovered that there was evidence of an indigenous site and trading center right here near Monument Square. They are sure that Center and South Streets developed from native trails. And one very interesting thing is that stone flakes from 2 different types were used in tool making were found on this site. One, which was to be expected, was the rhyolite that was mined and used by the Massachusetts people. However, they also found tools made out of quartzite, which is found in central Massachusetts and used by the Nipmuc tribe. And that led them to believe that this was indeed a trading center. In the 1650s, the first English settlers to build a house in this area was the Polly family. In 1735, the Wally family purchased the house from the Pollys. And then in 1746, Joshua Cheever, a selectman who lived in the North End, bought the house. And we know that Cheever enslaved 2 African men named Jack and Spencer. But we have not been able to locate any evidence yet about whether Cheever and his family or the people he enslaved actually lived on the property. But our assumption is that it's a possibility that he bought it as a country estate and had his main home in the North End. In 1552, Commodore Joshua Loring purchased the Polly Wally Cheever house and replaced it with this structure that we're sitting in here today that we know as the Loring Greenough House. And I'd like to introduce Andy Hatcher from the Loring Greenough House.
So,
Just press this number 3 button.
okay, thank you. And I will probably have to adjust this a little bit up. Say when. Okay, good. So we actually know very, very little about the Lorings and how many slaves they had and all of that, because it was so much a matter of course in their lives that they wrote and said very little about. So we consider ourselves very fortunate to at least have the bare names. Although in the case of two of them, there's going to be a second story. But at this point, we have the bare names of three enslaved people: London, Othello, and Phyllis. Of course, the English love to give their enslaved people classy names, like Othello, that showed off their own learning and pretensions and all of that, in spite of the very limited lives, of course, that their enslaved could live. These three names showed up in a will that Commodore Loring wrote as soon as he was forced to flee to Boston. As Dorothy said, the Commodore bought the house. The old house was moved across the street, became the parsonage of the church, but he lived here for 14 years. A mob came in August 1774, drove him off to Boston, where, as a Tory, where he had a second townhouse. He lived there for a year and a half until they were forced to leave in March 1776, evacuation day. So as soon as he got, seemingly as soon as he got to Boston, he wrote a will because he realized it was a little bit iffy if he would be able to return. So, but he believed that he would. Nobody took the rebels very seriously. So he wrote a will in which he explained what he would do in different circumstances and what his wife would inherit. This is the very next thing that we know about, and that's London. This is the second sort of incident with London. But I'm sorry, down. Oh, no, I'm getting ahead. It's up is
Page up.
9. Okay.
Anyway,
No,
on that
okay.
one? Is
Yeah,
that-
yeah, this is good. Thank you. So his will essentially said that if his wife did not marry after his death, she would have the whole farm here. If she remarried, she would have his townhouse and the use of these three slaves, London, Othello, and Phyllis. Of course, he may have had other slaves. This is just what he put in his will. But so the next slide that I jumped ahead to is what happened after the Commodore died. He died in London after actually the Battle of Yorktown and the effective loss, but before he knew about it, because news took longer to travel. So he died believing that he would be able to give this to his wife, but he could not. Because the war had been lost at Yorktown. So anyway, so the will said that she would get all of these three enslaved people in the event. And the reason for that was that women who were married could not own their own property. They could own money, but as soon as they married, their property went to their husbands. He did not want this farm going to some gold digger husband. So he, he gave it to his children instead, but he did give her the house and the three enslaved people who would maintain her standard of living. Now this is from another, and this is one of many wonderful things that are Jamaica Plain Historic Society exclusives. This is an article written by a member of the Jamaica Plain Tuesday Club in the 1950s, a wonderful amateur historian of the time, Commodore Joshua Loring, Jamaica Plain by way of London. She went to London to look at the National Archives, and she was the first to find Mary Loring's memorandum, as it was called, which was an inventory of all the property that they had to leave behind. what had happened after the war ended, Parliament passed a law allowing some reimbursements to loyalists who had lost all their property. So they already had their inventory all at the ready for that. And this is a tiny, tiny part of their inventory. But one of them that they mentioned was a Negro man named London. So she mentions only one of the three. What that means is they considered him a true loss of the war. He may have run away. Something happened to him that made him unavailable. What we can deduce, though, of the others, Phyllis and Othello, is that he actually sold them, and he did get reimbursement that way, or he may have given them to a family member. In the event, so in the event, it turned out that his daughter-in-law and his son, he must have given Othello to his son, because we know of an incident involving Othello a little later on. So here is this strange connection between his daughter-in-law, who was Elizabeth Lloyd Loring, and an enslaved person who became the first published 18th century Black writer, Jupiter Hammond, who grew up and actually was enslaved by 4 generations of the Lloyd family on Long Island, Lloyd Neck. So he was enslaved. Elizabeth Lloyd was from that family. She came to Boston and she married the Commodore's son, Joshua Jr. So that is that connection. And just because a lot of people don't know Jupiter Hammond, this is of course, a quote that really resonates today. That liberty is, and this is from the African Society of New York in 1786, when he was in his 70s, that liberty is a great thing we may know from our feelings, and we may likewise judge so from the conduct of the white people in the late war, the revolution. How much money has been spent and how many lives have been lost to defend their liberty. I must say that I hope that God would open their eyes when they have been so much engaged for liberty to think of the state of the poor Blacks and to pity us. We will get a very definite resonance of that when we get into the Greenoughs, because the Greenoughs did enslave. They had an Antigua plantation, which we're going to tell you about. And at the same time, he was a famous patriot. Thomas Greenough, his father, was a member of the Committee of Correspondence, the Committee of Public Safety. They actually learned about this house in the first instance because they met here when it was taken over. So a little more about the Lorings and Joshua Loring. They were enslavers. During the Revolutionary War, Elizabeth became the mistress of General William Howe, Commander-in-Chief of British forces in America. She traveled with Howe and her husband, Joshua Jr., to New York after Evacuation Day. And then, so there was a letter from, at a time when Joshua was in town in Manhattan. His wife was very possibly at the Lloyd estate. She was on Long Island. This was August 1776, and it was the Battle of Long Island, which is one of them. So as that was coming on, he wrote this letter to her. I would not go out of town, but should it prove true, I shall be obliged to go to Long Island in the morning to take up all the rebel officers, in other words, to engage militarily with them. In that case, I will send you word. Town with you, shall I send for you to come to town? Let Othello come with Cornelius, presumably another enslaved, on one of, and it cuts off, the general's horses. So to me, this, of all the Loring, we have little scraps of names. This is the scrap that has the real human interest, and that is, and I didn't give you the wobble warning, but at certain points in presentations, I get a wobble because I feel very strongly about something. I have a whole history, and I won't go into that, but my father was acquainted with Martin Luther King, and it's one of the most wonderful things that I had in my upbringing. One moment. So Joshua Loring Jr. trusted Othello. He had the highest belief in his capacity to bring his wife to safety in New York. He got General Howe to give one of his own best horses to his enslaved person in order to do this. And yet, because of their compartmentalized thinking, none of that came through and had any effect whatsoever on the actual status of Othello. And so, anyway, that's the thing that gives me the wobbly voice, and I went over that for the evening. Okay, now the Greenoughs come to Jamaica Plain. Soon after the Lorings left in 1774, this house was confiscated by the Revolutionary Army. It was a commissary for the troops. This was right in this room, for the commissary of troops for the Continental Army stationed in Roxbury. It was a hospital for wounded soldiers, as well as soldiers that got smallpox, especially after Bunker Hill, and a bakery for Roxbury troops, both in our kitchen, in our beehive oven, and on outhouses in the building. The Greenoughs, as I mentioned this, Greenoughs knew of the house because of David Sutter Greenough attending meetings. After the revolutionary property was auctioned. And then in 1784, the house was purchased by rich widow Anne Doan in preparation for her second marriage to David Sutter Greenough. And here we transition to Dorothy, who's going to talk about Greenough's local slave, his Jamaica Plain enslaved boy. And later on, I'm going to talk about some of his remote holdings.
All right. Oh, yes. He's tall. He's taller than I am. Okay, great. And you're just pressing which is, oh, I see. Page up.
Page down.
Okay. So on July 30, 1785, David started Greenough the first, paid one of his slaveholding neighbors, John Morey, the second, for a 5-year-old boy called and known by the name of Dick. Priced at £5, the child had been born in Morey's household, the son of his, quote, Negro servant, Bina, close quote. Dick was to serve the Greenoughs in the capacity of servant for 16 years until he reached the age of 21. But this bill of sales, which is available online at the Mass Historical Society, this bill of sale doesn't define what in the capacity of servant means, but it clearly shows that Morey's intention to dispose of this item of human chattel. 2 years earlier, Morey had begun divesting himself of his Jamaica Plain properties, and he was planning to move to Middleborough, where his wife had inherited her father's farm. Now, keep in mind as I go through the rest of this that Mimi told us earlier that there were a series of court cases in 1783 that formed the legal basis for emancipation. After that year, that's when the use of indentured children escalated. And these were children who were poor, were orphaned, Black, white, indigenous, and they were used to provide free labor. So, okay, thank you, dear. All right, back to that bill of sale. So the 1785 bill of sale for Dick is a curious document. I've looked at that document for years and I only noted this curiosity like a couple of days ago. So those are just some of the things that, you know, make you go wobbly, a tingle when you're doing this research. That document doesn't mention the words slave or slavery, but it uses the more socially polite euphemism servant. Nor does it mention indenture. However, it does contain a telling detail. The so-called sale of Dick was written in such a way that the child would be indentured to the Greenoughs, not enslaved by them, and he would be bound to that family until he turned 21. I can't help but wonder why that document was written in that way. So I want you to think about that as I continue to go through here. So a year later, on September 6th, 1786, the legal status of Dick, who was now 6 years old, was converted from ownership to indenture. Because Dick apparently had no parents or guardians to enter him into such an arrangement, the Roxbury selectmen approved the change of the document. So it was converted from a bill of sale to a term of indenture. Then Dick's term of service was backdated to run from April 15th, 1786 to April 15th, 1801. Another kind of discrepancy with dates, maybe these guys had a lot of work to do, but let's jump ahead a little bit to March 14th, 1787. Two Suffolk County Justices of the Peace endorsed the indenture of Dick to the Greenough family. So let's see. Okay, so here we have a chart showing what was curtailed depending on what your legal status was. Whether you were enslaved or indentured, and then depending on what race you were. So apparently anybody could be indentured, but only African descended people and indigenous people could be enslaved. This is America's notion of, or practice of, chattel slavery. I'm sure we all know, and everyone does talk about it, most history books do tell about it, that slavery has existed all over the world for all time, but it was rather unique in the New World because it was chattel slavery. And what that meant was the individual was a piece of property to be sold and traded and moved around without any thought to that this is a person. So if you're a child, particularly maybe an indigenous child or a Black child, you would be enslaved for life. Maybe you'd get a little education, and whatever you had, whatever clothing you got to wear was not your property. It belonged to the person who was the enslaver. Indenture contracts were different. They were for a specified period of time. Some of the benefits that indentured people had were being taught to read and write, at least the rudimentary pieces of that, so that they would have the ability to move around or develop some skills later in life. And their contract surely came to an end. Okay.
Can I ask a question? Enforced the contract, if you will. So yes, the contract was supposed to come to an end. Yes, there was supposed to be contributed, right? And that's
Mhm.
skills, but who enforced that, if anyone?
On your honor, no one came in and checked to see, is this person who is under this indenture contract now going to be set free? So, maybe we'll find out some more stuff about how that sort of thing happened. So then we start to wonder, who were Dick's parents? Here we have this child who, when he was 5 years old, was sold away from his mother. According to that 1785 bill of sale, Dick was the child of an African descended woman who was named Bina. We don't have a last name for her. And she's described as a Negro servant in the household of the aforementioned John Morey II. John Morey II had inherited Bina from his father, who had died in 1771. He also inherited much more. Now, according to his father's probate inventory, which is extremely lengthy, randomly placed in the listing of items that John Morey I had, items such as 43 pounds of cheese, 3 old powdering tubs. If you don't know what that is, I'll tell you after we finish the presentation. A peck of parsnips and onions, the old black horse, 3 swine, and 2 old iron pots. Listed among those items are 4 black children. There's a boy named Cato, who is about 12 years old, an unnamed girl who is about 11 years old. There's another girl named Bino, or Bino, who is about 7, and a girl named Zipra, who was called infirm. No age was listed for her. Bina, is very possibly a variation on the spelling of Bina. And she would have been 16 years old when she gave birth to Dick. So that bill of sale then, at this point, is the last we know anything of Dick's mother. We have no clue about the identity of Dick's father. However, the description of this child as mulatto in the 1785 bill of sale is evidence that the man was perhaps indigenous, he could have been mixed race, or he could have been white. And it's not beyond the realm of possibility that John Morey could have fathered Dick. Now, at this point, I want to say a note about terminology of these 2 documents, the bill of sale and the indenture document. And it took me a long time. Well, it was like last week when I put this together after looking at those 2 documents for over 10 years. I realized that in the 1785 bill of sale, Dick is called mulatto and his mother is called Negro. In the 1786 indenture document, Dick has become Negro. In this revised capacity as a Negro indentured servant, Dick was to learn the art, trade, or mystery of a farmer, after the manner of an apprentice from David Stoddard Greenough. And now, if you keep your eyes on the birdie, you'll see Dick does another transformation later. As an apprentice, Dick's behavior was expected to be, let's see, So his behavior was expected to be above reproach and saintly in some instances. So some of the conditions that were placed upon him, uh, which, as listed in this indentured document, it's kind of like what we call boilerplate. It's a standard form that was used to create indentures. But this one, the folks creating the indenture crossed out certain parts. So the conditions placed upon Dick, as well as other indentured people, were uh, unwavering faithfulness to the master and mistress of the house. He was also prohibited from wasting or unlawfully lending his master and mistress's goods. He was to refrain from playing cards, dice, or any other unlawful games. There would be no fornication or matrimony. Tell that to a 5-year-old. But again, that's the nature of that standard document, that boilerplate, where it was being used for anyone of any age who was being indentured. Dick was also prohibited from haunting or frequenting taverns, alehouses, and places of gaming. Now, for David Stoddard Greenough's uh, part of this bargain, uh, in addition to promising to, quote, to teach and instruct or cause Dick to be instructed in the art, trade, or calling of a farmer, in parentheses, provided the child was capable of learning. He was to provide food, lodging, and clothing for Dick. And at the end of Dick's indenture term, Greenough was to give him 2 good suits of apparel, one suitable for church, the other for work days. So I started to wonder, at what age did Dick's apprentice training begin? Is it something that's done with a 5-year-old? Probably was back in those days. What age was he actually put to work? Was he actually part of the Greenough household, or was he relegated to an outside role? Did he have the run of the house, or was he banned from certain places inside the house as well as elsewhere on the property? So, not ready for that one yet. So, we can speculate all we want. We can infer or make certain assumptions based on information, but it's a lot of guesswork. But the questions to, or the answers to some of those questions could be in the papers of David Stoddard Greenough, which are housed at the Massachusetts Historical Society. Not all of the family papers are digitized, however. For example, there are, well, some of them are, some of them aren't. So among the ones that are the farm diaries that David Stoddard Greenough I and David Stoddard Greenough II kept. And they're interesting to read, with things like, accounting for, well, we got some manure today, and like 10 pounds or whatever. Just all sorts of really basic, prosaic, I opened the door to the barn. But those are online. You can have a look at some of those. The diaries of David Stoddard Greenough II are a little more interesting. His are more like diaries. So he talks about going into Boston with father to get hay, or had dinner with so-and-so. So I want to comb through those papers more to find mention of people of color. In an entry from one of the David Stoddard Greenough I's diaries, 1825, there is mention of hiring a black man named Mott Johnson to mow a field of clover. And thus far, that's really all we've kind of seen there in terms of, we haven't found any mention of Dick and the training that would be going on there. There are papers that aren't digitized, and those include accounts, bills, receipts, surveyors' maps, inventories, wills, deeds, other estate papers, and documents that concern the family business, property transactions. So that's going to require making appointments at Mass Historical and going through microfiche to see what can be found. Now, David Stoddard Greenough had one child, David Stoddard Greenough II, and he was 7 years younger than Dick. So, I then started wondering, well, how did these two boys interact? And given that age difference, they probably didn't. Given the racial difference, they probably didn't. At any rate, I doubt that they would have been playmates. But it'll be nice to find that out. Okay, Dick's departure. With only about 2 years left on his indenture. And I should not use the word only there, because 2 years when you're not free is a long time. But Dick emancipated himself. This we know because Greenough took out an ad in a Boston newspaper called the Columbian Sentinel. And he took that ad out on July 4th, 1798, offering a $1 reward for the capture and return of, quote, an indented mulatto servant by the name Dick Welsh. See, I told you Dick was going to transform into something else. So he went from mulatto to Negro to mulatto. And this one I can explain a little better. But also notice I called him Dick Welsh. He had become Dick Welsh also. He was no longer called by the surname Maury, though we have no information as to when or why that change occurred. Also, being, he had transformed back into the mulatto that he was when John Maury sold him to David Stoddard Greenough. Why is he called that in this particular ad seeking his return? Well, there's no photography at this time. So owners of human property had to rely on very detailed descriptions of what their so-called runaways, I call them self-emancipated people, looked like, just so someone could find them. How accurate were these? Well, if you're talking about the clothing that they were wearing or the clothing that they owned, that's pretty good. You just didn't like dump clothes and go get new ones. You kept what you had for a long time. And clothing was rather distinctive. So according to Greenough, it's like Dick Welsh took every item of clothing that he owned, which included a broad cloth coat, a chocolate-colored short coat, a drab-colored cloth greatcoat. I mean, he really like packed his bags and headed out of there. And using the term mulatto in this ad was helpful, or would be helpful, in terms of describing what this individual looked like. Now, that would be a great aid in returning this young man, now 18, back to the Greenoughs. Was Dick successful in escaping? We don't know for sure, but probably not. federal census enumeration for 1790, and that was the first year national census was done. And the federal census 10 years later, 1800, listed or categorized all the residents of the Greenough household as white, except for one. And that person was classified as all other persons except Indians not taxed. Dick's indenture was slated to end in 1801. When the next federal census was taken in 1810, all the Greenough household members were listed as white. So Dick was no longer there. And I do have hope that we will find out what became of it. Why did his name change? Did he change it? Was it changed for him? Was it changed to place more distance between John Morey and Dick? But I have hope that we'll find more information on Dick, especially because just a couple of nights ago, I stumbled onto something which was, it's like 11:30 Saturday night, and I've got no one to shout this out to. But out of your curiosity, while on the Mass Historical Society's website, I saw the name of a book, which is called Laws of the African Society, instituted at Boston, Anno Domini 1796. This book was the rules of the African Society, which was a benevolent organization of Black men. The last page of this book lists the founding members. And among the founding members was someone named Cato Morey. And how many Cato Moreys could there have been? So I did a little math, which I'm not very good at. But Cato was listed in John Morey the First probate list. And he was a child of about 12 then. So if this is the same Cato, and he kept the name Morey, he would have been about 37 years old. And it appears he was a free man. Yeah. Okay, Andy, take it again.
So, yes, thank you. This is more like this. Tell me what, okay. So this is another part about the Greenough history. We've been focusing very much on things that physically happened in Jamaica Plain, such as Dick Morey's life. But of course, an important part of the life of all the people living in this neighborhood was where their money came from. One of the reasons that David Stoddard Greenough was able to buy this house, he was eligible because of an inheritance he got from his father and actually from his mother, Sarah Stoddard Greenough, which made him attractive to this rich widow and who he actually married. So the Greenoughs actually came into possession in 1774 an interest in a sugar plantation in Antigua. And this is kind of the highlight. So until they used it, they continued profiting from it long after slavery was illegal in this state, because it was actually 50 years later in 1834 that slavery was actually ended in Antigua. We are the very proud possessors of this painting, which you can't see. You see much better on the screen, but here it is. It is a picture of the Yemens, who were a completely unrelated family, whose property in Antigua went to the Greenoughs by a fluke of inheritance, having to do with the fact that Shrimp in Yemen's son died unmarried. And so the property went to three great aunts. And one of those was Sarah Stoddard, and just married to Greenough. Oh, thanks. Are you gonna? We have an actual video embedded here. So one of the wonderful things that happened this year is we met Rachel Childers, who is an objects conservator at the Museum of Fine Arts. She comes to our Thursdays on the lawn. She was interested in contributing to the house in some way. And so this was a little video of her. So she took off this horrible brown varnish and put on some clear varnish, which took her about all of 2 minutes. It took about 3 days to get all that brown varnish on. So you can see almost better than in the original over there. Basically, this is John Yemens showing his son. All this you will inherit. So this is probably a map of Antigua. Here's a sort of impossible juxtaposition of an English, following, probably, by the way, they lived part of their lives, like so many of that class in England, in London. He was listed as being from Richmond, and the rest of their lives in Boston. So they had connections to both places. So here's a couple people looking. Here's a ship sailing off the sea, bringing money back to me. And then very, very, it's very faint here, but there's a bluish edge of what is probably the island of Antigua. It's the case where people of that class did gloss over where their money was coming from, and they liked the pretty blue Bali High image of what Antigua was as opposed to what it really was. So this is I'll do this very quickly. This is another Mrs. John Yemens. This one was from Barbados. They were a huge family, but this shows that in her Boston life, she also had an enslaved person, John, an adult Negro servant, and Mrs. John Yemens of Barbados. So they had basically, with their lives, they had their Boston servants who were enslaved. And then the big money makers, of course, were the sugar plantation. This is a map from the 1740s. This painting, by the way, is from about 1740. And this is a map of the same period. And he was a grandson of another John Yemens with holdings in Barbados. The grandfather was called a pirate ashore. He was instrumental in creating the Carolinas as a slave economy colony of Barbados. We do not usually think of North and South Carolina as being created as colonies of Barbados, but they were basically, and was the governor of the colony. He was believed to have poisoned his business partner in order to marry his wife, and then he had these descendants, including his grandson, John Yemens, who's in this picture. Here's a close-up of that map showing one of the Yemens, William Yemens. This I Yemens, they didn't distinguish between I and J in that period, so that's John Yemens. And it just shows how many English people had these very profitable holdings in Antigua in the 18th century. I mentioned this briefly. Shoot got it, the son in the center of the picture. His son, who was just a child who died of consumption on ship to Boston, en route to Boston in 1774. So Sarah Greenough got it, and then this is an important point because here's another local notable, William Sumner, after whom Sumner Hill is named. He was another who had this big interest in, and he was the son of Increase Sumner, who was the governor of Massachusetts. Part of this Boston mercantile nexus where they just all intermarried. So this is from study, a Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery, a little bit about shoe shrimp and Yemens. Other David Hislop's, how they registered 100 people on the estate and so forth. So this went on, as I told you, from the 1770s when they got it, until it became, why did they get rid of it? Not out of high moral principle, but because it became very, very unpopular. What happened, this, by the way, is from collections of the Massachusetts Massachusetts Historical Society, which were given in 1924 by the last Mrs. Greenough, who was here the year that the Tuesday Club bought the house. In all these account record books, David Stoddard Greenough kept this plantation accounts. This is at the end. He went on, there's one on and on year after year, all the little dollars that were expended for disbursements between 1818 and then March of 1819. But the big picture is what happened. The slave trade, of course, was abolished in England in 1807. There were American laws in 1800 and 1808 doing similar things. And there were several other reasons, but it simply became unprofitable. So what happened is in 1819, David Jr.'s investment in an Antiguan plantation failed, resulting in bankruptcy and casting a pall over the rest of his life. This is when he had to move his family into this house. There was a quitclaim, all these legal maneuvers to keep from losing the house. And then he describes how that happened. So that was the end. They were forced, essentially, then the end of legal slavery in Antigua. This is just a little last ironic, horrible sort of fillip, which is that enslavers were compensated by Parliament for the loss of their human property after this law. The Yemen's estate, sorry, David, you missed out. They were awarded £1,500, which is about 400,000 in today's dollars for emancipating 99 people, even though the actual lives of those people didn't change. They were de facto remained as slaves because they had nowhere to go. They had no way of negotiating a proper income. That's the very, very sad part about that part of the history of the Caribbean. So then there's a last part. Can I just borrow some more? Are we? I'll take my chances. So Anna Greenough Burgoyne. David Stoddard Greenough had a daughter, Anna, who married a man who was from the South, Henry King Burgoyne. What I'm getting into this is sort of the aftermath in the sense of history moving forward. We're getting from the early 18th century to the middle 18th century. So David Stoddard Greenough II died in 1830. Yeah, he'd already lost all this Antigua money. She married in 1838 this Southerner she had met in New York, Henry King Burgoyne, who was hoping to have a career in the North as an engineer. However, he inherited a large farm after the sudden death of an uncle, and she traveled to North Carolina to meet his family. She was appalled to experience the slave economy at firsthand. I grow more opposed to slavery every day and think I would rather be reduced to poverty that have anything to do with it. Of course, I didn't go into this, but there was also this business, this sort of sexist business going on the whole time, where the men kept to themselves their little secrets about how awful where their money was coming from, with the idea of protecting their, tender-hearted ladies. So anyway, here's what happened. She was completely opposed, but she did something about it. Henry and his brothers intended to manumit the enslaved on their own property when the plan could be worked out. This was truly unheard of in the American South, but partly because he had been educated in the North, partly because he was being influenced by his wife and her Boston connections. They came up with a plan to import Irish workers from New York and Boston for specialized work. In 1848, Henry made these arrangements with Anna's cousin, Mr. Doane, but the experiment proved a costly failure. The family's attempt to ameliorate or escape the conditions created by slavery proved beyond their control. So Mimi, at this point, is going to, this is an arbitrary cutoff, but this is the main Greenough connection to slavery that we wanted to talk about. So Mimi's going to finish up.
So I think where do we go from here? We are going to be obviously based, you can tell we're going to be continuing this research. We want to publicize the findings. There's already an article on Dick Moore and Welsh on the JP Historical Society website, and based on the fact that we're always finding things, I think some of the Dorothy's discoveries over the last couple of weeks, we're going to start to reshape that article a little bit and add to it. We also want to add some of this information, which is not yet up, onto the Loring Greenough House website, and we want to do more programs like this. And to do that all, we need your help. So we'd like to encourage you to volunteer with us, to research, do web development, and whatever else you have to offer. We will gladly be happy to discuss it because we want you. So thanks to our sponsors for tonight. Thanks for attending, and please join us. So now we'll take comments and questions. And we have a number of people, I hope they're still on board, and we'll alternate between people in the room and people online. So let's take one from the room first, if there is one. Otherwise, I know there's some from the. Yes.
I just want to know, you said that in, was it 1783, the slaves petitioned for their freedom, right?
Yes. It was when the court cases were actually decided.
Okay.
The Clock Walker case in particular was the one that's considered the deciding factor.
And then they were, I guess, free, right?
Well, the answer is yes and no. Oh, okay, I'll repeat the question for the folks at home. So the question was, in 1783, after the Clock Walker case was decided, were enslaved people free? And the answer is no. No, they were not. There was no proclamation of emancipation that you are free. That did not happen. What it did was it laid the legal basis for people who were enslaved to self-emancipate, to either leave or to sue their employers owners, the enslavers, for their freedom. And that meant that the courts would then come in on their side. And it made it much harder if they self-emancipated for the former enslavers to go after them, because the law was on their side.
They were allowed to self-emancipate then.
After 1783, yes, after the decision of the Clock Walker court case, yes. But not everybody did, and not everybody could, because where were you going to work? How are you going to get a job? How are you going to support yourself? There were free Black communities that developed. The biggest one was, there were two. One was in the North End, and the other well-known one was on the north slope of Beacon Hill. And that became actually, in terms of abolition, it became the hotbed for the African Society that Dorothy mentioned and the beginnings of abolition activities in Boston.
Can I
Did you-
say something? Because the case of Dick actually is a perfect example. Because there's another word in there, what is the word again? The way they actually enslave people, but they use another word to say that till the age of 18 and 21.
Indentured.
The indentured, yeah.
Yes. So I think that was the way to actually go
Well,
around.
Right, the indenture, you're right.
Exactly, yeah.
So the comment was, from the audience was that, the development, or I shouldn't say development, it had been developed long before, but it was an escalation of indenturing and became a way to keep people enslaved or to find other sources of labor that could be contained, if you will, and not be not walk out the door.
It's basically circumventing the law.
Yeah.
We see a
Yeah.
lot of that, well, it's throughout history.
Yeah.
And it's disheartening, but they knew what they were doing, and they knew how to get around these things.
Okay, so let's take one from online.
So online, you have a question about maps. Where are there maps in the estate showing where enslaved people lived, across and surrounding the land?
Okay, so I guess the question is, are there maps of where enslaved people in Jamaica Plain lived
Particularly, they're asking
In-
about foreign people.
around Loring Greenough? And the answer is no.
Not important enough interest,
Do you
not
want to talk
important
to
enough
the,
to record that information because the people it concerned were so insignificant. I think that's the correct thing to say. And as they saw it. So no, that information was almost never reported.
question from the floor here? In the back?
So, to your question, we have to hire lawyers to pursue law to free them if they did not self,
So if people didn't self-emancipate?
Yes.
Yes, lawyers were certainly involved in,
How do they?
well, that's, in some cases, legal, there were people who were sympathetic, who offered their own legal advice. In the case of Mama Bet, that was one of the people whose court cases was won in 1781. She went to a neighbor of the place where she was enslaved, and that person was a lawyer. He helped her win her freedom, and she ended up working in that household as a free person for that lawyer's family. And that is a story, actually, the Historic New England owns that house. And you can go visit that house and learn more about that story on their website. Or her story, I should say, her history.
And that lawyer was Sedgwick.
Yeah, Sedgwick.
Same name of the
And
street.
we think he might be related to the Sedgwicks of Jamaica Plain, for which the street is named. So another online question.
We know where enslaved people died, where they were buried.
Do we know where enslaved people were buried when they
I
died?
can give one example.
Speak.
Yes. One example. Jupiter Hammond had this distinguished career, lived to about the age of 90, 4 generations. He made this address. He published religious poems, to that extent. In many cases, he was he was influenced by the society he was in. He was a spiritual person, but also a political, as I've read. He is believed to be buried in an unmarked grave on the Lloyd estate in New York. So that's probably pretty common.
Yeah, it's just a further comment on that. It is it was very common for enslaved people to be buried in unmarked graves. And we know that, for example, in Cambridge, there's a lot more information about that. And I believe Historic Cambridge has that information on their website. In the room.
This is a very painful question to ask as a mother, but do we know whether Dick's mother remained local, and also whether at the time indentured servants were allowed interaction with their families, or is this just family separation straight up?
This just looks like family separation. Like I said, it looks like Maury and,
Oh, we should repeat the question.
so the question is, because the person in the audience finds that it's very painful hearing about a child who was separated from his mother. Was this, tell it to me again.
I wondered whether or not we know anything, whether the mother was local, remained local, and whether there were opportunities for an quote unquote indentured servant to see their family if they were a child.
Yeah, so she's asking if the mother, perhaps Dick's mother, remained local, or with other indentured children, were there opportunities for them to see their family? Ooh, I would venture a guess that maybe if they were white children, maybe, but likely not. They were just there. Their families who no doubt couldn't take care of them, which is why they were sent off to an indenture. They probably didn't see them much. About Dick's mother, haven't been able to find what happened with her. What I do know about John Morey is that once his wife inherited the farm in Middleborough, he was just selling like crazy, getting rid of his stuff like crazy. He sold his land. His property was on both sides of Center Street, upward that way. He was selling off everything. So he possibly sold Vina as well.
Yeah, and it's also possible that Mina went out to Middleborough.
Yes.
That's another,
I gotta look there, too.
We haven't had any evidence that we can point to definitively. I would say, as far as indentured children are concerned, the Old North Church has done some excellent work, and there is a series of YouTubes that you can get to from their website. And they talk about a family, a Black family, that had to indenture their children because the family couldn't support itself. And it talks about the relationship of how, I think one of the kids kept running away trying to come home. But often, there were communities, they were close, these communities were fairly close knit, and people were expected to come to church. So that would sometimes be an opportunity where some enslaved people might get a chance to see other enslaved people. One would hope family. But, I'm sure for some it was, and some it wasn't. So shall we take another from online?
Yeah.
This, and then we'll wrap it up, do the last
But I
one.
think this is a good ending question. How would you advise someone to begin researching their own town's slave history?
Their own towns?
History of enslavement.
What we would recommend for people who want to get started in investigating their own town's history with slavery. I think you just have to get started. Start Googling. There is so much, it's unbelievable what's on the web these days, and more keeps coming up. Find out who the local people were. Well, first off, hook up with your local historical society and see what they have, if there is one. See what they know about the Jamaica Plain Historical Society did us a great favor because they did have some articles that we were able to Google. You have to use, unfortunately, terms in quotes, Negro or other terms that we would use today to find those, because those were the terms that were being used at the time. But you may get some things popping up. There are, find out the names of the people who settled the town, who were the early residents, and then Google on them. And you will go to the Mass Historical Society and put that into their search thing. If you happen to have, you can go to Family Search, and also that's free. You can go to American Ancestors. The library has that available, or you can buy a subscription. And you can, if you start just using your curiosity and going as far as you can, and using every lead that you get and following it up and just keep picking at it, you'll get enough information that you'll start to be able to connect the dots. And start to, it took us 2.5 years to get to this point to be able to tell these stories, but and there's more to go. But I feel confident that if you're in Massachusetts and you just start scratching, you'll find it.
And check out the Massachusetts State Archives.
Yes.
And they do have records digitized. I found that a really good place to look for things is probate inventories.
Yes.
Because people love listing all of the stuff they own. And that will tell you a lot about what's going to whom and what they had. And so, yeah.
And the other thing is, Harvard has a database of 1771 tax records that you can sort. You can sort by town. It will bring up records that say servant for life. And that's how we found several, like that John Hancock was listed in Jamaica Plain and had 3 servants for life here, and Pemberton, and one of the former governor, Pepperell, and one of the other former governors, Governor Bernard, had people, and they were listed as servants for life in Jamaica Plain. So that's how we found those individuals. So thank you, everybody. We appreciate it.
Thank you.